What if one of the world's most powerful financial hubs suddenly collapsed? Singapore may be small in size, but it is a giant in global trade, banking, and shipping. A crash in Singapore wouldn't just shake Southeast Asia, it would send shockwaves across the entire world. Millions of jobs would vanish, shipping routes would freeze, and fragile economies would crumble overnight. Some countries would adapt, but others are so closely tied to Singapore that they would face total collapse. In this video, we'll uncover the 10 countries that would collapse first if Singapore's economy crashed in 2025, and explain why their survival is so deeply linked to the Lion City. 10. Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka is still recovering from its devastating 2022 to 2023 economic crisis, which brought food shortages, fuel lines, and mass protests. The country's economy remains fragile, and Singapore plays a critical role in its survival. Most of Sri Lanka's crude oil is imported and refined through Singapore before arriving in Colombo. If Singapore collapsed in 2025, Sri Lanka would immediately face a severe fuel crisis, driving up transport and electricity costs. Inflation, which has already been high, would spiral out of control again. On top of that, Singapore is a major financial gateway for loans and investments into Sri Lanka. Without that access, Sri Lanka would be pushed back into default and face another round of economic instability. 9. Myanmar. Myanmar's economy is already struggling under sanctions, internal conflict, and limited access to global markets. Singapore has long been one of Myanmar's top investors and financial intermediaries. Many businesses and wealthy elites use Singaporean banks to store assets and facilitate international trade. If Singapore collapsed in 2025, Myanmar would lose one of its few financial lifelines. This would mean fewer foreign investments, stricter access to global markets, and an even deeper cash crisis. Myanmar also depends on Singaporean companies for oil, gas, and logistics. Losing this critical connection would paralyze its fragile economy, worsen unemployment, and create food and fuel shortages. Already unstable, Myanmar could tip into complete financial and social collapse almost overnight. 8. Laos. Laos is one of the most debt-ridden countries in Southeast Asia, heavily borrowing from China and international institutions to fund infrastructure projects. Much of its trade and investment flows pass through Singapore, which acts as a key regional banking hub. If Singapore collapsed in 2025, Laos would struggle to access foreign capital or settle international payments. Its exports, like electricity from hydropower projects, rely on Singaporean financial networks and shipping routes to reach buyers. Losing this system would cripple government revenues, pushing Laos closer to default. Already facing rising inflation and weak currency, a collapse in Singapore would make Laos unable to pay off debts, worsening poverty and sparking nationwide instability. 7. Cambodia. Cambodia has experienced strong economic growth in recent years, but much of it relies on Singaporean investments in real estate, infrastructure, and finance. Singapore is also a key gateway for Cambodian exports, especially textiles and agricultural products. If Singapore collapsed in 2025, Cambodia would lose billions in foreign direct investment, causing a property market crash and widespread unemployment. Financial flows through Singaporean banks would dry up, leaving businesses unable to operate smoothly. Cambodia's tourism sector, which benefits from Singaporean airlines and investment, would also take a major hit. Without Singapore's stabilizing influence and capital, Cambodia's economy would shrink rapidly, pushing millions into poverty and creating social unrest. 6. Thailand. Thailand's economy is highly interconnected with Singapore's financial system and logistics network. Many Thai companies depend on Singapore's banking sector for loans, investments, and currency stability. If Singapore collapsed in 2025, Thailand would face a shortage of foreign capital, disrupting its business environment. Additionally, Thailand relies heavily on Singapore's shipping routes for exporting cars, electronics, and agricultural products. Tourism, another critical sector, would also suffer, as Singapore often serves as a regional hub for travelers heading to Thailand. The shock would weaken the Thai baht, raise inflation, and damage investor confidence. Thailand's economy, already vulnerable to political instability, could face a deep recession, mass layoffs, and slower long-term growth. 5. Vietnam. Vietnam has become one of Asia's fastest-growing economies, but much of its success depends on Singapore's trade and financial networks. Singapore is among the largest investors in Vietnam, funding projects in real estate, technology, and manufacturing. More importantly, Vietnam's exports, textiles, electronics, and seafood, often pass through Singapore's shipping and logistics hub before reaching global markets. If Singapore collapsed in 2025, Vietnam would lose both capital inflows and a vital trade route. Factories would slow production due to supply chain disruptions, unemployment would rise, and foreign investors might flee to safer markets. With its economy still transitioning, Vietnam would face a severe downturn, making it one of the hardest-hit countries in Asia. 4. Philippines. The Philippines has a large overseas workforce, and Singapore is one of the top destinations for Filipino workers. These overseas workers send billions in remittances back home, which supports millions of families and fuels the local economy. If Singapore collapsed in 2025, thousands of Filipino workers would lose jobs, sharply reducing remittances and pushing many households into poverty. Beyond labor, the Philippines also depends on Singaporean investment in infrastructure, energy, and banking. Singapore serves as a trade and shipping hub for Philippine exports like electronics, coconuts, and garments. Losing this gateway would slow trade and raise costs, worsening inflation. Combined, these shocks could cause the Philippines to face a serious financial and social crisis. 3. Brunei. Brunei's small but wealthy economy relies almost entirely on oil and gas exports. However, much of this petroleum trade is refined, stored, and managed through Singapore's massive energy and shipping infrastructure. If Singapore collapsed in 2025, Brunei would lose its primary trade route and refining partner, crippling its ability to export oil efficiently. This would devastate government revenues, as oil accounts for nearly all of Brunei's income. Without this income, the government would struggle to maintain subsidies, welfare programs, and public services. Although Brunei is rich in resources, its overdependence on Singapore for trade and financial services would leave it extremely vulnerable, pushing the country toward a sharp economic downturn and possible collapse. 2. Indonesia. Indonesia is Southeast Asia's largest economy, but it is heavily tied to Singapore through trade, finance, and investment. Many Indonesian companies, and even wealthy elites, use Singaporean banks for security and global access. Singapore is also a top investor in Indonesia's industries, from real estate to energy. If Singapore collapsed in 2025, Indonesia would face capital flight, reduced foreign direct investment, and disruptions in its exports, many of which pass through Singapore's shipping hub. The Indonesian rupiah would weaken, inflation would rise, and unemployment would climb. Given Indonesia's large population and existing economic challenges, a Singapore crash could trigger widespread instability, protests, and even political turmoil, making it one of the hardest-hit nations. 1. Malaysia. Malaysia would collapse the fastest if Singapore's economy crashed in 2025. The two countries are uniquely interdependent, economically, socially, and geographically. Over 300,000 Malaysians cross the border daily to work in Singapore, sending home billions in remittances. If Singapore fell, these workers would lose jobs overnight, devastating Malaysian households. Beyond labor, Singapore is Malaysia's second-largest trading partner, importing goods, palm oil, and raw materials. Malaysia also relies on Singaporean investments and banking services to sustain its economy. The sudden loss of trade, jobs, and capital would cause Malaysia's currency to weaken sharply, push inflation higher, and trigger mass unemployment. No country is more directly tied to Singapore's stability, making Malaysia the first to collapse.